Welcome to this panel on nationalism, media, and propaganda. And as I said, trust editors to pick absolutely the worst news day in 5 years for a session like this and for a conclave like this. But be that as it may, we all have to soldier on. And I'm, sure that the discussion we have today will in a sense, reflect closely on events that have unfolded over the past 5 years and which are going to unfold as we go ahead. There's any number of directions in which a panel with this title can go: nationalism, propaganda, and media. What I thought is that I'll take advantage of the fact that we have three experienced reporters and journalists who have kind of over their careers straddled and dealt with issues of nationalism and propaganda in various ways. And I thought that I would maybe draw them out on different aspects of the way in which nationalism and propaganda operate. Each of them will, I've kind of picked a set of questions for each of them just to get them going. I will phrase these questions before I invite you to speak. And I hope you confine your remarks to 7 to 8 minutes each, so that we have then about 20-25 minutes for discussion from the floor. I'm not going to bother introducing any of the speakers because they've already been done. But let me kick things off with Suhasini. Suhasini, is the media today capable of being professional and objective when it comes to the broad set of subjects that come under the term nationalism? And in your experience and based on what you've seen in your years earlier in television, now with The Hindu, what are some of the challenges that journalists face when it comes to covering issues of foreign policy and national security?
Thanks a lot, Siddharth, and thank you to the Editors Guild for inviting us for something, which is a kind of daily battle that foreign policy journalists, I'm on the foreign policy beat, play out every day. Some of those battles are played out on Twitter, and you no doubt see, how they are. And it all boils down to one idea. And I'm being simplistic here, but it boils down to the idea of the question that we are asked again and again on Twitter. Are you an Indian or are you a journalist? Somehow your role or your label as an Indian or your identity as an Indian is expected to completely sort of subsume all other identities, including what you do. I often answer them by saying, I am an Indian. Being a journalist is what I do. And there is therefore a distinction. But it has become much more difficult over the years for a number of reasons. And I'm not saying India is a sort of outlier. There are many countries where some of the things I'm going to speak about you see. There was this idea in the old days of the difference between nationalism and patriotism, and nationalism meaning that you loved your country. Sorry, patriotism meaning that you're proud of your country for what it does. And nationalism means you're proud of your country no matter what it does. In other words, you're not expected to question. There are three ways where I would say when you cover foreign policy and national security issues, where things are not only changing, they are becoming more and more difficult. The first most obvious one is in how we cover those countries that are seen as adversaries to India and to the government in particular. So in the old days, those would mean China and Pakistan. Today, they mean China, Pakistan, Canada, Maldives, anyone the government is having a spat with within the week. And what we actually see is because a lot of this is also, self-decided. It's not as if there's some diktat coming on every issue from some official. At the end of it, what you do here is other journalists who have become more adversarial than the government itself. So in the most recent case with the Maldives, for example, you had a situation where journalists had already built scenarios of war, of taking it out on the Maldives, of showing them their place, economic boycotts as well as other security boycotts. Whereas in actuality, what the government has agreed to do is to hold talks to continue to hold those talks, and eventually to accept the Maldives' demand that Indian troops would be pulled out of the Maldives, and that if the Maldives doesn't want troops in uniform, that you send technical civilian personnel in their place. So I give that just as an example to say this is the mahal, this is the atmosphere we're in when we're dealing with them. When it comes to countries like China, when it comes to countries like Pakistan, let's remember we are not in a state of war. There is no declared war with them at present where other laws would come into place. At present, we are just in a situation of major tensions with them. According to the Prime Minister and a comment he made way back in 2020, which he has never updated. So I presume that this remains the government's official position. Nobody has entered Indian territory and no Indian post is with anybody else. That's what he said in June 2020 on national television. That hasn't changed yet. And yet, on a daily basis, journalists are harangued, journalists are held up for stories that are seen as in some way playing to the other side. We see that, of course, with Pakistan, which also brings in a certain communal flavor to that kind of thing. So that's one, where those that have an adversarial relationship with India, we are expected to be even more adversarial than the government is. And if you aren't, then you are clearly in some way, biased, motivated, or worse, working for the other side. The second is the loss in the ability to do critical analysis of agreements, even with those areas where India has good relations. So if we have a deal with the US, it becomes that much more difficult to find ways to analyze it. In 2015, January, the Prime Minister and the US President Obama stood together, and these are technical issues, I'm not trying to simplify them for you, but they stood together and said, the nuclear deal is done. It is now 2024, and clearly that nuclear deal was never done, or the understanding which was going to allow American manufacturers to begin nuclear power plants in India, that deal was never done. Now, critical analysis at that time was completely shut down, was denied by the government. Critical analysis over a period of time is made irrelevant. So that intelligent conversation that we seek to have with our reader or our viewer actually goes away. If it's a deal with France, you are not allowed to critically analyze, did we pay too much? If it is any other kind of investment that India is making, or it is the decision to increase oil from Russia, again, the idea is fine. If it is a policy statement that India is increasing its oil intake from Russia, if it is going to route it through half Russian-owned refinery, and then actually is going to what is now being called oil laundering, then produce it as refined products and sell it back to the West. Somehow even that kind of critical analysis is now lacking, and those who do it do tend to be able to tell you what kind of reactions they get. And the third part, I think, where we feel it on a daily basis is the gradations of ways in which people who cover national security and cover foreign policy in particular are targeted. So at the top level, we consider ourselves lucky until we have to deal with those challenges. There are those who face real national security laws, whether it's journalists in Kashmir, or whether it is journalists, in organizations here who have been raided, who have been arrested. The bar of evidence is so low that you can't even ask what the evidence is. Just the severity of the cases, and this is not frankly happening just now, it's been happening for a couple of decades, where you have allowed normal laws to become applicable, normal security laws to become applicable to journalism as well. In the old days, there was a different standard with that. Then the next level is the insinuation, the stories that government denies even though they're true, and certainly puts out the insinuation that they are motivated, biased. And of course, that is picked up not just, for example, in Twitter, because it's possible to just go off Twitter or X or whatever it's called, but in websites that are government funded, which have specific beats of specific journalists and put out stories about what they do. And I think the third is the general restriction of access. Whatever is happening between Indian and Chinese forces at the LAC, This must be the first such conflict where there is no journalist who has been able to go further than Leh. I think except for one or two examples where journalists were flown for maybe a few hours to the LAC, shown something, and they're brought back. There is no coverage of the conflict. How is it going? There is just an acceptance of how it's going, which is great. How's the Josh? High. And as a result, we have allowed ourselves to walk into smaller and smaller cages where the ability to cover issues which have always been complex, which have always required a certain expertise, those are the issues which have unfortunately been simplified into how are we doing? Great.
Thanks a lot, Suhasini. You've touched on the broad brush as well as hinted at specific examples, and I'm sure in the conversation that we have with the audience, we will get into individual examples, case studies, and so on, that will illustrate what she's saying. Our next speaker will be Smita Gupta. Smita, you've worked as kind of political reporter and editor, going back for the tenure of 4 or 5 governments. You know, more starting with the Independent or perhaps even earlier. With Indira Gandhi, okay. And since I've known you and we worked together, Times of India, you were then in Outlook, then in Hindu, and now as a well-regarded commentator, freelancer. How, your focus has been politics throughout your career, but politics clearly intersects the arenas of nationalism and propaganda. And, you've seen firsthand. So in your view, obviously, journalists have always faced challenges in this arena. How has this evolved or changed over the different governments and regimes that you've seen? And is there something specific about what we are confronting today?
Thank you, Siddharth. As I said, I joined the profession when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, in 79 actually. So the first 2 Prime Ministers that I saw were at a distance, Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi. And the period that I covered, Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister. I was at the Indian Express, where it was a virulently anti-Congress newspaper, But we just saw it at a distance, and but I'll just recall one small incident when there was a riot in Bhiwandi. I used to be posted in the Indian Express, Bombay. And Mrs. Gandhi came there on a visit, accompanied by Rajiv Gandhi, who was Party General Secretary, Congress Party General Secretary. And our common friend, Vidya Subramaniam, had been sent to cover it that day. And Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister, but she was standing next to Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was talking to one of the victims, and she was trying hard to hear the conversation. When Rajiv Gandhi apparently said, "What's he saying?" To which Vidya said, "If you just shut up and listened, you would hear clearly." To which Rajiv apologized, So we are going back to a time when, we were in our early 20s, and we would think nothing of doing something like that because so intent on the story. But my actual interactions with prime ministers began with VP Singh. And if VP Singh epitomized open government to a fault, I ended with Narendra Modi, who, as we all know, represents closed government. There are dangers to an open government, and which is why that government fell in those 11 months. But for journalists of my generation and those of us who were covering the Janata Party, Janata Dal at that time, the government, we could get stories from everybody. We could go into ministers' rooms, ministers' homes, in the evening without an appointment, and people would talk to us. This was largely peopled by the socialists who are destructive, as we know. But for somebody starting out, it seemed like that was the norm. Chandrasekhar was a very brief sort of period, and that was somewhat similar. Then we came to Narasimha Rao. Now Narasimha Rao, but even there was a structure. there was you always had the Press Information Bureau. You had officials there. You had a principal information officer. And as far as I remember, right up to Dr. Manmohan Singh's period, that principal information officer was expected to hold one to 5 briefings a week. Some like Mr. Rammohan Rao, who actually, I think, dealt with 3 prime ministers. He made it a practice to do it, where people were allowed to ask questions. Obviously, he wasn't going to tell you state secrets, but he would give you enough information to be able to do your story, add something to your story. You could call him up at 12 at midnight, and he would say, "Let me see," and he'd call you back in 10 minutes. So there was that structure. In the Prime Minister's office also, there were certain officials. I remember Jairam Ramesh used to be there, for instance. I was still fairly junior, but those who were senior to me had access to many more officials. Then we had, after that came Vajpayee. Vajpayee also had despite the fact that that's also the BJP, he had Brijesh Mishra, who would talk to journalists about policy issues. He had, Mr. Ashok Tandon, who was a general media advisor. He was also extremely open. He would, you could talk to him, you could call him up at any hour of day or night and get a response. And ministers, by and large, whether they were Arun Jaitley, Sushma Swaraj, all these ministers, to greater or lesser extent, we never felt that that we couldn't get any access to information. Everybody obviously will tailor their stories to their own advantage, and it is for you as a journalist to do your homework. But you had a government point of view. Then came Deve Gowda, which was somewhat more similar to the VP Singh Chandrasekhar era, where it was even more open. And, I remember in Parliament, for instance, Srikant Jena was the Parliamentary Affairs Minister. His room was like the rest room for journalists between, people would go there, take a nap. But you would also understand, because the Parliamentary Affairs Minister is a key person during Parliament to understand what is happening, policy issues. Then came the Manmohan Singh government, where again, all these structures were still in place. And in fact, at that time, I remember the joint secretaries in the Prime Minister's office. I don't know whether people know, each of them is given a certain number of subjects to deal with. And you could actually take appointments with any of them. You wanted to talk about economics, you went to Javed Usmani. You wanted to talk about the Home Ministry, you went to Sanjay Mitra, and so on. And, you were able to get that extra, you knew what was happening. Apart from all this, what I forgot to mention is that all these prime ministers, till Narendra Modi, used to have an annual press conference where, the Prime Minister would open himself up to all kinds of questions. Sometimes there were even some rude questions, I remember, and then, though this overlaps with, I think, something that Suhasini said, at that time, when the Prime Minister went abroad, the Prime Minister took a group of journalists, and you would have 1 or 2 meetings with him, sometimes on the outward and sometimes on the inward trip as well. There would be senior officials, not only from the Foreign Ministry, but from other ministries. So, you got a sense of what was happening in government. It was up to individual journalists to cultivate people to get that bigger picture. But with arrival of this government, it's closed shop. Mr. Modi has not had a single press conference. Forget the annual Vigyan Bhavan press conference. He doesn't take journalists on his plane. He's not saving any money because the plane is no smaller, and it's newspapers that are picking up the tab for the journalists who are going there. PIB is non-functioning, really. Nobody there is, there are sort of handouts, but no clarifications can be sought. The principal information officer is just somebody who sits over there. within the Prime Minister's office, there is a big communication setup, but it operates in the shadows. So there are questions, we all have questions, but there are no answers coming. Apart from all this, all prime ministers, as far as I remember, used to have an annual kind of dinner to which journalists were invited, political journalists. It could be on the occasion of the, the day they had taken oath, or it could be Women's Day, something or the other. So another occasion where you could interact. But under Modi, he does have some for selected journalists, I'm told, but there is no conversation there. I think most journalists who go there spend their time taking selfies and which you then see on Facebook and so on. So right now, that is a situation where nobody is asking even for state secrets, but you just want an explanation that why did you sign this treaty with X person, or why are you bringing in this bill? But it's closed. It's closed government.
Thanks a lot, Smita. Hartosh, Smita has focused on an important aspect that has of press functioning, which has so completely vanished from our lives that it sounds odd to even be reminded that there was such a thing as some measure of openness. So thank you for that, Smita. But Hartosh, as editor of the Caravan, you are part of a small but vibrant ecosystem, and I want to emphasize that this ecosystem has publications in different languages across the country, small, medium, large, some large, lots of freelancers who are battling away. So not everything in this country is big media or Godi media. There's a large, vibrant section. Caravan is very much a part of that, and you have been dealing with challenges. Now, in your estimation, particularly in relation to the question of nationalism, that is the theme of our panel, do you foresee? I mean, do you have any sort of advice on how media can deal with the challenges that present themselves today, and what is your sense of how these challenges are going to evolve over the next few months and years? Are things going to get worse? If so, how does one respond? Could they get better?
Thank you, Siddharth. As far as the question of advice goes, I wish I had some. I actually don't. It's a bad time in terms of journalism. I think our current situation is of a sort of a prey enveloped by a boa constrictor that is slowly and gradually but inexorably tightening its grip. And the breath is being sucked out of us in some ways. And this is only going to accelerate. To whatever extent that this ecosystem has to survive or resist or breathe, I think we have to understand how we've got here and what are the changes. And some of it will overlap with what Suhasini had mentioned. I mean, it is not as if when Modi came to power in 2014 that we had a very robust, healthy media system. I also want to just stress that I prefer not to use the terms media and journalism interchangeably. The term media is, and I try to repeat this, is the equivalent of the administration that runs hospitals, and journalists are rather like the doctors in the hospitals, and we cannot confuse the two. The exercise of journalism in the end remains with journalists. Media is the infrastructure that provides us this. The structure of the media itself was hollow by the time Modi comes to power. He understands that from Gujarat. I also just want to compare sort of two stories I was involved in because it reflects directly on the kind of control that was exercised. And the first was the Radia tapes that we had first done it open. And there were two things that was evident in the Radia tapes. It was the close sort of nexus between politics, journalism, power, corporates. I think that's true even today as we are seeing on this particular day of what the relationship between electoral politics and corporates and big money is in this country. What happened with that story is that the mainstream media actually was aware of it for a long time and did not touch it. It's not very different from the electoral bonds in the sense that everybody is aware of how bad the situation was and nobody touched it. But once it did come out, that story, whether from social media or other outfits or other, even national organizations picked that story up. It got amplified. It had a lot of traction. And it did have a political impact on a large scale. I do remember in one of these studio discussions that was happening, there was a conversation with Veer Sangvi appropriately sitting in a balcony in Thailand, and there were four of us in the discussion. There was Rahul Kamal, that Tweedledee, Tweedledum to Rajdeep in that channel that they run. There was Prabhu Chawla, there was MJ Akbar, and they were discussing what is wrong with journalism. And to me, sitting in that room, what was wrong with journalism was the people in that room, basically. And these were people who had been editors for the last 15, 20 years. In some senses, responsibility for journalism also lies with editors. And so this is a pretty appropriate forum for discussing what is going on. But there was an impact. It made a difference. People reacted. That public that reacts to journalism has disappeared. The disappearance of the public is one of Modi's great feats in journalism. That what he has, instead of the public, he's created what I would call are the equivalent of football fans. It's that people have worn the Modi jersey, and once you've worn that Modi jersey, it doesn't matter what Team Modi does. You are not going to listen to it. You are not going to take negativity on it. And everybody is on the other side is an opponent, is not to be trusted. And journalists lie on the opposing side in some senses. We saw that when we did the Loya story at Caravan, that it was surrounded by the same silence. But this time when the mainstream media picked it up to say, why were these guys doing the story? What were their motives? There were prime time shows run on my predecessor, Vinod, on me, what we had been tweeting, how we were anti-national. This construction of this football fanism as opposed to the public, which doesn't react to journalism, is necessary to curtail the power of journalism. If you no longer have a public that reacts to a story, then the story doesn't matter. We are finding some of that out today. In the face of what we are hearing today, if a government can survive and still go into an election expecting that it will win, then we have reached the point where the truth no longer has any significant impact on how politics is played out. We are in the domain of mass psychology. Journalists do not dwell in the domain of mass psychology. We do not address it. We deal with facts, with rationality, with arguments, and that's not the domain in which arguments can take place. Lastly, despite all this, this government is still bothered by what the small ecosystem does. And I think this is where you've seen the boa constrictor actually tighten its grip. It happened to us recently. You yourself, Siddharth, there have been raids at the Wire, other organizations, NewsClick, but we actually this time had a story taken down without recourse. We are fighting it in court, but the new laws have reached that absurd level where we report on Kashmir. And Kashmir is a good example of how we have all been reduced in our reportage. First, Kashmiri organizations could no longer report journalism from Kashmir. Then Kashmiri journalists could no longer report our own, and I think Shahid is in this room, so of literally being hounded out from Kashmir by threats. When a journalist from outside goes and reports on Kashmir, and we get detailed stories with testimonies and narratives and facts, the story is pulled down not because there's a problem with the story. We don't even know who's asked for the story to be taken down. There is no complaint. Nothing is shared by us. And there is no process that is followed. There is not a single error that the government has pointed out in the story. It has invoked national sovereignty. How is national sovereignty in challenge when the Indian army tortures Indian civilians to death? There is no easy answer to that question. It is clear there has not even been an application of mind, because it says they are acting on complaints regarding what can happen within the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and they take down a tweet that relates to a story on Manipur, basically. So clearly these are ad hoc responses, but the government now has been empowered to be able to stop news in any possible way. I don't think that the answer to this lies with the organizations. We can keep doing the work we are doing. We can keep pushing back. But there has to be a larger ecosystem of pushback that includes the public, which doesn't exist, which includes political opposition, which doesn't exist. I think that is also part of our real problem that we should be honest in speaking about. The political opposition does not seem very interested in press freedom itself. It seems to react to criticism much in the same way as the ruling government does. I'm not positing an equivalence, but they need to listen and understand what is going wrong with them and what is not being done even on a loaded deck. And that is not something that they are comfortable with. In the absence of that public, in the absence of a political opposition, in the absence of a sustained intervention by the judiciary, we are at the stage where we are going to see an acceleration of what is happening. In that, maybe what we do as an election show, reaching out for support, trying to work together, trying to strengthen other organizations which function in the same way, is perhaps the only choices available to us. But we cannot control the larger ecosystem. We have to see it in change in some ways before things give.
Thank you, Hartosh. So you've heard three complementary presentations or sort of narrations about the problem of media and propaganda and nationalism that confronts us. I just want to add my 2 cents before I open the floor. To my mind, the cutting edge of the government's sort of offensive today is the takedown order. And the ability of the government to invoke obscure sections of the law and to prevail upon social media intermediaries to deal with, to ensure that content is made invisibilized. It should be a simple question of logic that if a statement or an article is not proscribed by law if it is printed, then it ought not to be proscribed if it's got a digital life. You can still go to a newsstand and buy the Caravan's magazine, and that's because there is nothing in it that contravenes any Indian law. It's fully covered by Article 19 of the Indian Constitution, whatever its reasonable restrictions may be. Yet the same article online, the government has arrogated to itself the power to get this content removed. I can share with you information from today. We had published an excerpt from the Caravan's article and given a link which exists in the public domain in the internet. Various friends of freedom of information have posted the article on PDFs that are beyond the reach of Government of India censors. So we'd given a link, and we got sent a notice to an address that that was actually not our proper address on March 1st, and they held a so-called hearing where we were not present, and then a takedown order was issued. We are appealing it and challenging it, but we've also had no option but to take down the extract that we carried from Caravan. But we are not the only victims. I mean, you would have seen in today's papers, or maybe you read on internet, the takedown of CBC documentary on Pannu's on Nijjar's assassination, takedown of huge number of farmers' Twitter handles. So the farmers are not allowed to march, and they're not even allowed to make videos and reach people through peaceful democratic means. So this kind of invoking of national security, one way or the other, to clamp down on freedom of expression, which the government is not able to do when it comes to the printed word, is something which I think should really concern us. And I'm glad that the EGI exists, and the EGI has been very vocal now for the last decade or so in speaking out in defense of media freedom, and in particular, I would say our colleagues in J&K who not only can't report, but there is an unofficial travel ban. Many colleagues have been stopped from flying abroad on assignments. They've had their passports confiscated. So we're dealing with a very, very critical situation here. And obviously part of this means that there are any number of stories that are simply not given their due. They're not covered. Or they're covered in a very lackadaisical fashion. So the Pannu or Nijjar story ought to have been much bigger if there was really the press functioning in a free fashion. You don't see any debates on television on any of these issues. And that's the state of affairs. And in fact, those who, as Suhasini said, attempt to cover these stories are the ones who then get labeled and branded as anti-national. So I'd like to open the floor now. We have around 10-15 minutes, and I see a hand up over there. Please be brief, sir, and if you have a particular person you're directing a question to, please say so.
Absolutely. Very brief. My name is Professor Sanjay Airwal and I teach journalism. My students are here. Thank you, Siddharth, for giving me a chance. And I wanted to congratulate you, Hartosh, for having, and your magazine, for having done that story. We went out, we bought copies of Caravan, and all our students, they read the entire story. And nobody thought that it was anti-national. They thought it was very nationalistic to have done that story. So thank you, you and your organizations and all of you who are sitting up there for doing journalism like that, so that our students and us also will learn from it. Or you are talking about that there is no platform left in television, but at least there are magazines which do. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. There's a mic here, please, sir.
First of all, thank you all for holding up to whatever you guys do. My question is, I give you an example. There are innumerable examples. Let's take the example of the train. What happened in the train?
The RPF.
RPF.
Okay.
Yes. We as Indians, this is not directed to media, but as our role or what you guys will do. Now, we are seeing this football team, which you were speaking about, versus couple of you guys who are maybe table tennis team in the other side. We people as masses are getting inured by these experiences, these ugly sins day in and day out. So what is the solution, if at all? We cannot reject the football team as such. What is to be done to this country? Thanks.
I'm going to collect two other questions and then come back to the panel. Lady here in the front. Yahan de dijiye, please.
Greetings, panel members. My name is Nandika and I am currently interning for the Indian Express. So my question is, recently we saw how, mainstream media, some news organizations, they celebrated the idea of the government being involved in something as personal as religion, that is the Ram Temple inauguration. So, and we also saw how, young minds are being brainwashed with this idea of pseudo-nationalism. So what do you think, how do we avoid this situation where it leads to mass brainwashing of youth?
I'll come to you later, sir. Here in the front.
Thank you very much. We have been listening that we are very much, the government is formidable to media, and media and journalism is very, very difficult. These are the stories we are listening and we are feeling that there is. Now the question arises, why don't the media get into a proper training? This is your job to organize a proper training for a media person and a journalist and to give him ad hoc information of whatever is what is and what is not. Because unless and until a perfect training is given, you can't have a...
Got it. Right.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
Training is a must.
Thank you. I'll come back. Suhasini, you want to quickly answer anything from what you've heard? You can pick any of the one questions, any question.
Sure. To your question, I honestly feel, and this is something I read out of a book called How to Be a Dictator, and that does not mean that I'm talking about a dictatorship here. But there is a line in there where it says, everybody knows that an authoritarian wants you to do as he or she says. But very few realize that actually what they want you to do is what he or she, what they want you to do is say what he or she says. That's the difference. I think as journalists, what is important is to hold that line, to not be, pulled into the idea of being us versus them, as much as to hold a government to account. As the masses, as you said, or the readers or the viewers, I think what's really important is to understand that if you want real news, if you want credible news, you're going to have to pay for good journalism. This is something that we've shied away from in the past. We all do believe that journalism is a public service, but it is not a public service that can be done for free. And it requires for people to understand that if something is asking you to pay, and most people will put up a paywall or will ask you, is there some way you can contribute to this journalism? That is becoming more and more important. I think it's as much a signal to any government that wants to be authoritarian when people start paying for credible news. After all, people are journalists not because anyone can be a journalist. And you're absolutely right that there is training that goes into it, it's years of experience, and there's years of public service commitment. And the truth is that it's not that everyone can be a journalist. Society wants for journalists to do their job, which is to inform them better, to hold governments to account better, to ask the questions that nobody else is asking, or to put things in perspective that show you that what are the various points of view in a story. So I think it's very important to get that in. My real fear now is I see a version of what is happening here to the Indian media as a result of what is perceived as a fear of the authoritarianism is bleeding very easily into international media. We used to hold, when you were asking where should we look, we used to hold international media as basically quite fearless when it came to other countries. When you see something like the BBC story, where there's a documentary which seems to be critical of the government in India, which is eventually taken down by the BBC themselves, and the government puts a ban on it. What is really interesting is that documentary was never meant to be shown in India. That despite everything else, that the company didn't want to. And I won't name the other company, but I was interviewed more recently by an international news agency that ended the interview by telling me, don't worry, this won't show in India. We have to take back this idea that we are entitled to less of a democracy than other people are, that we are entitled to less truth than other people are, that we are somehow allowed to live in a bubble where we don't understand how the world is looking at us, because that's what's going to really cost us in the long term.
Smita, were you shocked by the
Yeah,
media coverage at the temple?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to see. The media coverage of the temple, and I'm just talking about the legacy media. I'm not going into anybody else. I mean, the Hindu, the Hindustan Times, Times of India, all three papers at which I have worked, I was shocked by the headline because it just didn't take into account the fact that a mosque had been destroyed, that there were a whole a section of people in this country who were distraught on that day, that it was not a day of celebration for them. Now, this is not something that you can blame an individual journalist. It's a senior people in the office. And now, why is this happening? I can't imagine earlier that maybe somebody might have given a neutral heading, but this kind of celebratory mood, which kind of echoed what the government was saying, it was truly shocking. And that also comes into this training. There is training, you get training at, you go to some journalism school and you are taught how to read laws, etc. But the real test comes in the newspaper. What is decided in the newsroom? What are the seniors in the newspapers doing? Or is it that they are under pressure from the owners? I mean, after all, the legacy media is the one that still has the money, still has some money. So, there are questions that need to be asked. In the old days, I don't know, editors knew the prime ministers on first name terms. I don't know whether that helped. I don't know. This is something, Siddharth, you could perhaps weigh in on more.
I'm not sure that's always a good thing for editors.
No, not as an editor. Because you understand economics much better than I do. That do you think liberalization had something to do with the way, newspapers, especially the big newspapers, change?
Yeah, I'll come to that at the end. But Hartosh, you want to make any response to the trading? Is lack of trading the issue?
I doubt if we are at a place where training is the issue or there's a lack of good journalists. There's a lack of spaces where good journalism can be done because the media itself is compromised. What we need, in fact, is to expand places where journalists can do what they need to do. Today, the situation is, and I speak of journalists who work in our organization and maybe some other organizations which are doing similar work, that they're perhaps the best journalists in the industry. The price of being really good at your job today, in a perverse sense, is to be paid less than everybody else who's compromised and who subverts every aim of the profession. And this is what we have created in terms of journalism. Also, this shrinking of the number of places where journalism can be done is happening at a time when the country itself, the numbers are increasing. From the time, to me, the existence of, I have worked as a district correspondent, as a state correspondent, of people actually being based out there reporting back. We don't have that any longer. We are surprised by what is happening in much of the country because we don't have access to it. We also haven't, and just one last point, that there are two things to the BJP project that makes it very successful as a political machine. One is the politics of hatred directed outwards as a community of 200 million people. There has been no historical comparison in the world to this kind of creation of a second-class citizenship. Outside that, actually the BJP is more capacious, more inclusive without changing the hierarchy of caste than the Congress ever was in 70 years. It has expanded its reach to castes and portions of society that we have not let democracy reach in 70, 75 years. We, in our newsrooms, have not expanded to include that capaciousness. We do not understand the portions that are being tackled and addressed by the BJP. We fail to report on them because we do not understand them. And that space has to be created. But that space is limited in small organizations. It can't be just done by small organizations. What we need at some point is a challenge where how do you create big media which takes on some of the strengths of this small segment of society of journalists that we are talking about and expands it. It's a very difficult scale up. I don't know.
I'm going to try to pack in two questions more. You had your hand up first, and then I'll come to you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. By the way, I'm Maulik Buch, and I come from the Masses land, Gujarat. So I think, hello.
Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
Yeah. My first question is, I have been trying to stay with the principles of journalism since 8 years. After being a journalist for 25 years and now an entrepreneur, the biggest challenge that I am being facing right now in Gujarat, having one Gujarati and one English publication, we are continuously being threatened. First thing. Second thing, it's not the authorities who threaten us. It's that messy guys who threaten us. Now, how to sustain in this environment, that is something which I am looking from all of you.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, good afternoon panel. I'm Dr. Smita Dasmana from WIPS. Today, you all are very senior professionals here in front of us, and today we all have recently seen this, one of its own kind of awards for the content creators. So I want to understand your take on this.
So, what are you talking about?
The Content Creators Award.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Very quickly, please.
Yes, thanks, Siddharth. So I think one of the common themes that we have heard from different panels since morning is the government is, really pushing down the media in multiple ways, through agencies, through laws, through UAPA, through its own IT cell and other people. So what I see it as, it's essentially a power game being played, where, the government is upping its power and reducing the power of the media. And if we look at, press as a fourth pillar of the democracy, now that pillar is being compressed so much that it's almost becoming like a stepping stone or a football to play with. So my question is, do you feel any possibility, any feasibility or merit in the idea of you putting together, the independent media, not the Godi media, getting together and pushing back and trying to regain that power? Because until that power balance is restored, I think the problem is not going to go away, and that is, in my opinion, it's the biggest issue today.
So 1 minute each, guys, and then I'll make closing comments for 2 minutes, and then that's the end of our time. So,
Yeah, and we hear you. It's not that we don't hear what you've said, Mr. Butcher, what you've said just now. We definitely hear it on a daily basis. My simple response to that would be that you don't have a choice. If you want to be a journalist, you don't have a choice but to do the journalism you do. You cannot suddenly decide to become something else, as unfortunately some have, where you're essentially a vehicle for government propaganda. The truth is that if you are going to be a journalist, there are so many other professions you can go into where you'd probably make more money and get more sleep. If you've decided to be a journalist, then there is no choice but to do this journalism. The second is the necessity to get up every morning with the idea that there are legal avenues, that you can fight back. I remember a close friend of mine who's a journalist said to me that he had spoken to a government official who said if the government put out 10 of these notices, instead of the 4 or 5 they put out every day, I do not have enough staff to go to the courts if they were to appeal. Why don't more people appeal? Why don't more people at least keep the rights that they can and push back, fight back, everyday fight back? And I think it's necessary to have that conviction that eventually it may not be a question that's answered today. But in 30 years, when somebody asks you the question, where were you when this happened? You will have a good answer for them.
Hartosh, any last thoughts? Under a minute?
Under a minute, just that the same thing that I think pessimism of the intellect, but we still have to keep doing what we need to do because it's necessary. We have to bear witness. We have to tell the stories that sometimes they will take effect. Most times they won't, but that is no reason not to do it. That's all.
Smita, last thoughts?
It really very much, except that keep at it, because I don't think we have an option really of opting out, because if you opt out, that is to accept defeat. So I think we just have to push as far as we can, push in the organizations that you work in, try and talk to other people, collect other like-minded people, perhaps within an office, push a story together, groups, solidarity kind of groups.
So you've heard some coping strategies. In the minute that I have left, I just want to emphasize the fact that we've chosen this profession for a reason, and that reason does not include having a peaceful time and going to bed worry free. That comes with the territory, and which doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with the threats and challenges in a smart and clever way. You need to be smart, clever, strategic, know the law, know your rights, push back at every instance, I think rely on readers and viewers, and I would appeal to all readers and viewers that if you care about independent media, you have to come forward and support them financially, because if you don't, then they will have no option but to collapse and wither away. And finally, having worked in large media organizations, I can tell you that there are so many moving parts that even the most determined government that wants to control every element of the narrative, it does not find it easy to do that, because it relies ultimately on some sub-editor, some deskie, some reporter. And I think we should shamelessly use our personal connections, contacts to push back to shame. I'll give you an example. You mentioned the RPF incident. Few hours after the RPF incident, I noticed a story with the byline of a young colleague, a former colleague of mine who used to be with me at the Hindu and now works somewhere else. And this person had done a byline story which consisted of planted information from what was evidently the railway minister, Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav, where he was saying, no, this RPF guy was not communal. After all, he shot his boss who was Hindu. And but this is unattributed information. So I told this friend of mine, I said, look, this guy is firing from your shoulder. Out of a train of 200 people, the only person that this RPF man shoots happen to be Muslim. He gives a communal speech. How can you allow this information to be pushed through like this? And the first thing I noticed was that the reporter's byline vanished. Then when I pushed, I didn't give up. I pushed further, and then I got the headline changed. I got the whole thing kind of redone. And ultimately, as you know, the RPF itself has been forced to admit what this man was up to. So, the fact is that, reporters are allowing themselves to be used by ministers, by bureaucrats, by officials, but to the extent to which we know these people, there's no reason why we should not name and shame them. I happened to bump into a Godi anchor at a lunch somewhere, and I made it a point to tell that person, and I didn't spare any words as to what I thought about the kind of work that they were doing. So I think use all these weapons and tactics. But I think the bottom line is, be aware that the work that you do comes with the risks. And I cannot emphasize enough what Suhasini said about the need to use the law. You can't allow things to go unchallenged, because if you do, the more we let these things go unchallenged, the more this problem is going to multiply. So with these words, I would like to thank the EGI for convening this panel on such an important topic, and for giving us the space to say what we've just said. Thank you so much.